Detective Ray Thompson had seen plenty of teenage deaths in his 23 years with the Springwood Police Department, but none quite like this one. He stood in Tommy Harrison's bedroom at 7:30 a.m., coffee growing cold in his hand as he surveyed what should have been a straightforward scene. The kid looked peaceful, almost serene. No signs of violence, no drug paraphernalia, no suicide note. Just a 17-year-old boy who'd apparently died in his sleep, his face frozen in an expression that made Thompson's stomach churn every time he looked at it directly. "What do you think, Detective?" Officer Patricia Wells asked, consulting her notepad. She was young, eager, still believed that police work was about finding answers and delivering justice. Thompson envied her that innocence. "Heart attack, according to the preliminary," Thompson replied, not taking his eyes off Tommy's face. 17 years old, perfect health, drops dead in his sleep from cardiac arrest. No family history of heart problems, no drug use, no obvious stressors. Maybe steroids? Wells suggested. He was an athlete. Could have been juicing without anyone knowing. Thompson shook his head. "Blood work will tell us for sure, but look at him, Wells. Kid's built like an athlete, not a bodybuilder. Besides, his father would have noticed behavioral changes if he was using performance enhancers." Frank Harrison sat in the living room downstairs, staring at his hands while his wife Linda sobbed quietly into a tissue. Thompson had interviewed hundreds of grieving parents over the years, and something about Frank's reaction felt off. Not fake, exactly, but disconnected. Like he was mourning the loss of an investment rather than a son. "We'll need to talk to his friends," Thompson continued, making notes in his own pad. "Find out if he'd been acting strangely, complaining about chest pains, anything unusual." But even as he said it, Thompson knew they wouldn't find anything useful. This wasn't his first unexplained teenage death in Springwood. There had been others over the years, kids who just died in their sleep with no apparent cause, always in clusters, always with that same look of absolute terror frozen on their faces. The official reports always listed natural causes: heart failure, brain aneurysm, respiratory arrest. Clean, medical explanations that satisfied insurance companies and kept the newspapers from asking uncomfortable questions. But Thompson remembered the whispered conversations among the older cops, the way certain cases got buried deeper than they should have been. "Sir?" Wells was looking at him expectantly, and Thompson realized he'd been staring at Tommy's face for several minutes without speaking. "Sorry. Let's bag the physical evidence and get statements from the family." "And Wells?" "Yes, sir. Keep this low-key. No media circus, no speculation. Just facts in the report." Wells nodded, though Thompson could see the questions in her eyes. He'd answer them eventually, when she'd been on the force long enough to understand that some mysteries were better left unsolved. Down the hall, Tommy's bedroom began to feel oppressive, the air thick with something that had nothing to do with death and everything to do with the lingering presence of nightmare. Thompson made a mental note to recommend the family have the house blessed, though he wouldn't put it in the official report. Some things were too strange for paperwork. The news of Tommy's death spread through Springwood High, carried by text messages and whispered conversations that stopped abruptly whenever teachers approached. By second period, the entire school knew that the star quarterback had died in his sleep, and by lunch, the rumors had evolved into increasingly elaborate theories about what had really happened. "I heard he was on steroids," one sophomore whispered to her friend near the lockers. "My dad said it was probably suicide," another student replied. "You know how much pressure those football players are under." But for 5 specific students, the news carried a weight that had nothing to do with rumors or speculation. They knew exactly what had killed Tommy Harrison, and they knew they were next. Sarah Mitchell sat in AP Chemistry, staring at her textbook without seeing the words. The molecular diagrams blurred together into meaningless shapes as her mind processed the implications of Tommy's death. She'd known it was coming, they all had, after seeing that burn thing in their dreams, but knowing and experiencing were 2 different things entirely. Her hands shook as she tried to take notes, the pen slipping from her fingers repeatedly. Tommy was dead. Really, actually dead. And she was going to be next. The thought consumed her, her analytical mind cataloging the evidence and reaching the inevitable conclusion. They were being hunted by something that killed through dreams, and simple logic suggested that each night brought her closer to her own demise. During lunch, she found herself in the library again, surrounded by medical texts and psychology journals she'd pulled from the shelves. Sleep disorders, sudden death syndrome, shared psychotic episodes. She researched everything, desperate to find some rational explanation for what was happening to them. But the more she read, the more hopeless her situation appeared. Medical science had no answers for supernatural predators. Psychology offered no defense against creatures that existed in dreams. Finding anything useful? Billy Crawford slumped into the chair across from her, his usual grin replaced by a hollow expression that made him look years older. Nothing that helps, Sarah admitted, closing another useless textbook. Everything I'm reading treats dreams as internal experiences, products of our subconscious minds. There's no framework for understanding something external that can invade our sleep. Billy nodded absently, drumming his fingers on the table in nervous rhythms. His legendary wood had abandoned him completely, leaving behind a raw vulnerability that was painful to witness. I keep thinking about what it said to me, he whispered. About the rope in my closet. I never told anyone about that, Sarah. Not even my therapist after my parents' divorce. Sarah looked up from her research, seeing her own terror reflected in Billy's eyes. It knows things it shouldn't know. Personal things, secret things. Which means it's been watching us for a while, Billy concluded. Learning about us, studying our weaknesses. Before Sarah could respond, Ginny Phillips appeared at their table, moving with the mechanical precision of someone in shock. Her usually perfect appearance was disheveled, her hair escaping from its customary ponytail and her clothes wrinkled as if she'd slept in them. I can't pray anymore, Ginny announced without preamble, her voice flat and emotionless. I tried this morning after I heard about Tommy, but the words won't come. It's like my faith has been severed. She sat down heavily, her composure finally cracking to reveal the frightened teenager beneath the perfect Christian facade. My father wants to hold a memorial service for Tommy, she continued. He's talking about God's plan and eternal rest and how we must trust in divine wisdom. But I keep thinking about that thing in the confessional, wearing the priest's collar, mocking everything I believed in. Sarah reached across the table and took Jenny's hand, a gesture that would have been unthinkable a week ago when they'd been strangers divided by social circles and academic competition. We need to stick together, Sarah said, though her voice carried little conviction. Maybe if we're not alone. It won't matter, Mark Stevens interrupted, appearing beside their table like a ghost. He looked terrible, hollow-eyed and pale, with the distinctive tremor of someone who'd been mixing substances in dangerous combinations. Tommy wasn't alone when it got him, Mark continued, his voice hoarse from whatever he'd been smoking. He died in his own bedroom with his parents down the hall. Being together won't save us. Lisa Campbell joined them last, sliding into the remaining chair without speaking. She'd been crying, her eyes were red and swollen, but now she seemed drained of all emotion, operating on some basic survival instinct that kept her moving when everything else had shut down. We should run, she said quietly. Leave town, go somewhere far away. And go where? Billy asked with bitter laughter. You think dreams respect geographical boundaries? You think that thing can't follow us wherever we go? Then what do you suggest? Lisa snapped, the first real emotion she'd shown all day. Just sit here and wait for it to pick us off one by one. The question hung in the air between them. They were teenagers, still dependent on parents and school systems and social structures that couldn't protect them from supernatural threats. They had no resources, no special knowledge, no weapons that could harm something that existed in dreams. They were prey, and they all knew it. There has to be something, Sarah insisted, her scientific mind refusing to accept complete helplessness. Some way to fight back, some weakness we can exploit. Maybe we could find others who've survived this, Jenny suggested weakly. People who've encountered this thing before and lived to tell about it. Mark shook his head. You think this is the first time it's happened? Look around, Jenny. See how the adults react when we mention dreams or sleep problems. They know something, but they're not talking. As if summoned by his words, Mrs. Kowalski appeared at the end of their table, her weathered face creased with worry and recognition. The elderly librarian had been watching them for several minutes, debating internally before finally approaching. You children need to be very careful, she said quietly, glancing around to make sure they weren't overheard. There are things in this town, old things, that don't like to be disturbed. Sarah leaned forward eagerly. You know what's happening to us? Mrs. Kowalski's expression grew pained. I know enough to tell you that research won't save you. Knowledge won't protect you. The best thing you can do is try not to sleep alone, and pray that it loses interest before. She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Before what? Billy demanded. Before it finishes what it started, Mrs. Kowalski replied, then walked away quickly, leaving them with more questions than answers. The remainder of the school day passed in a haze of fear and desperate planning. They compared notes about their dreams, looking for patterns or weaknesses they might exploit. They discussed staying awake indefinitely, though they all knew that was impossible. They talked about sleeping pills, about staying together, about anything that might give them an edge against their supernatural stalker. But beneath all their desperate strategizing lay the cold truth that none of them wanted to acknowledge. They were outmatched and outgunned, teenagers facing off against something ancient and evil with nothing but their wits and their terror to guide them. The wake for Tommy Harrison was held that evening at Fletcher Funeral Home, a Victorian monstrosity that had been serving Springwood's grief for over a century. The building squatted on Elm Street like a gray toad, its Gothic architecture and weathered stone facade lending an air of permanent mourning to the entire block. Sarah, Billy, Ginny, Mark, and Lisa arrived together, having agreed that they were safer in a group than alone. They signed the guest book with shaking hands and filed past Tommy's open casket, each of them struggling with the surreal experience of seeing their friend's body lying peacefully in satin-lined luxury. Tommy looked younger in death, his face relaxed except for that lingering expression of terror around his eyes. The funeral director had done his best to minimize it, but those who knew what to look for could still see the fear frozen in his features. He looked so small, Jenny whispered, her first words since they'd entered the funeral home. He looks dead, Mark replied bluntly, earning sharp looks from the other mourners nearby. The viewing room was packed with Tommy's teammates, classmates, teachers, and family friends. Coach Peterson stood near the casket in his best suit, his usual boisterous personality subdued by grief. Tommy's parents sat in the front row, accepting condolences with the mechanical politeness of people operating on autopilot. But it was the adults' behavior that disturbed the 5 survivors most. The older residents of Springwood, people who'd lived in the town for decades, moved through the funeral home with the careful, deliberate steps of people walking through a minefield. They spoke in hushed tones, avoided making eye contact with Tommy's friends, and left earlier than social conventions would normally dictate. Look at them, Sarah murmured to her companions. They're scared. Of course they're scared, Billy replied. Kid their town's age just dropped dead for no reason. That's scary enough. No, Lisa said quietly. It's more than that. Look at Mrs. Henderson from the school office. Look at Mr. Walsh. They're not just scared of death, they're scared of us. She was right. The adults who'd lived in Springwood long enough to remember previous cycles were treating the 5 teenagers like walking plague carriers, giving them wide berths and cutting conversations short whenever they approached. The most disturbing moment came when they encountered Dr. Morrison, the family physician who treated all of them at various points during their childhoods. The elderly man took one look at their group and his face went gray with recognition and fear. You children should go home, he he said urgently, his professional composure cracking. "Go home and get some rest. Everything will be better in the morning." The lie was so transparent that even he seemed to realize how it sounded. Dr. Morrison's hands shook as he hurried away, leaving them staring after him in confusion and growing dread. As the evening wore on, reality began to feel increasingly unstable around the edges. Conversations seemed to echo longer than they should. Shadows moved independently of their sources. The temperature in the viewing room fluctuated wildly, from uncomfortably warm to bone-deep cold and back again. Most disturbing of all were the moments when Tommy's body seemed to shift position in his casket. Not dramatically, just subtle changes in the angle of his head or the position of his hands that could be explained away as tricks of the light or exhausted minds playing games. But when Sarah blinked and saw Tommy's eyes open for just a split second, staring directly at her with that familiar expression of absolute terror, she knew they were no longer dealing with natural phenomena. "We need to leave," she whispered to the others. "Now." They made their excuses and fled the funeral home, spilling out onto Elm Street with the desperate haste of people escaping a fire. Behind them, the Victorian building loomed against the night sky like a malevolent presence, its windows glowing with light that seemed wrong somehow, too bright, too steady, too much like burning eyes watching from the darkness. "Did you see?" Jenny began. "Yes," Mark cut her off. "We all saw it." They stood on the sidewalk in uncomfortable silence, processing what they'd witnessed and what it meant for their chances of survival. The boundary between dreams and reality was breaking down, which suggested that their tormentor was growing stronger, more confident, more ready to finish what it had started. "Tomorrow's Friday," Billy said eventually, his voice hollow with despair. "End of the school week. If this thing follows any kind of pattern, it'll probably come for one of us over the weekend." "How do you figure?" Lisa asked. "Because that's when we're most isolated," Billy replied. "Most vulnerable. No school to force us to stay awake, no structured activities to keep us busy. Just long, empty hours alone with our thoughts and our fears." Sarah nodded grimly. "He's right. This thing is smart. It's been planning this for weeks, maybe months. It knows our schedules, our habits, our weaknesses." "So what do we do?" Jenny asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "We try to survive the night," Mark said, lighting a cigarette with shaking hands. "And then we try to survive the next one. And the one after that. Until either it gets bored and goes away, or..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. They separated reluctantly, each returning to homes that no longer felt safe, to bedrooms that had become battlefields in a war they couldn't win. As they walked away in different directions, none of them looked back at the funeral home. If they had, they might have seen a tall, thin figure standing in one of the upper windows, watching their retreat with obvious satisfaction. The burned face split into its characteristic grin as razor-fingered hands pressed against the glass, leaving streak marks that would be gone by morning.